Hi everyone, this is Mo Volans for Audiotuts.com, and this time I want to try something a little bit different, and this is really aimed at those of you who are making recordings with handheld stereo devices like digital dictaphones, dedicated stereo recorders, and iPhones even, other mobile phones. Just every single handheld device that's got a stereo mic on. Now these can be really useful for grabbing gigs quickly or grabbing live performances quickly, but sometimes the recordings they produce can be less than desirable. And I'm going to show you a couple of things you can do to sort of rescue a problem recording or rescue a recording that's got, difficulties. And what can happen is you can set the level too low, the position can be incorrect, maybe too far away from the band, or maybe the device just isn't up to capturing all the frequencies and, it sounds a little tinny. Now, obviously, there's only so much you can do with these recordings, but I'm going to show you an example of recording I got, and it's just a jazz band, and here it is. This is just loaded. It was an MP3, so I'm guessing the recorder only stored MP3, and it's actually very, very quiet. And on getting it and trying to listen back to it with one of the band members, we could hardly hear it. We had the the studio monitors and the interface jammed up to max, and we could hear it was okay. Nothing really wrong with the recording. And luckily, it being digital, there's not really any noise there. So it was just far, far too quiet. And, I'm guessing not that bottom end heavy. So there's a few things we can do. Now, first up, even with it being an MP3, you're going to really need to load this into a sample editor. So I'm using Soundtrack Pro here. And this is a big file. So it's going to take a while to sort of generate an image. So I'm going to let it do that and then come back. Okay, so here's the image generated, the waveform generated for our entire live recording. And straight away we can see how low the level is there. And also I can see straight away that there's crowd noise, I'm guessing, front and back. So we can cut that off. And this is pretty large file, so the edits take a little while. If they take too long, I'll zoom away and come back. I think I've taken a little bit too much off there. So, it's nice to have some crowd noise if it's a sort of a live event. So simply using, Command and X there, I've just gone and cut the intro and sort of outro off the crowd noise. And you could be using like really any sample editor here at all. It's, it's really not, you don't have to use exactly this one. You can be using Wavelab, pretty much anything you want. You can even do it in your DAW, but this is really just about a workflow. So once we've got that, I would go ahead and check the intro. Yeah, okay, so the instruments are starting around here, and it's still very quiet, so I think that's about right. So, zoom the whole thing to fit, and then the first thing you really want to do is normalize it. And this is going to analyze the audio. Okay, so the audio is analyzed, and I'm going to have to keep cutting away here, because it is a large gig. And now it's basically found the loudest point. It's showing us the peak level here. And ultimately, we want to get this up to as loud as it can be. And then we'll go ahead and do some editing. So I'm going to go for 0 dB and let it do its thing. Okay, so we're back and it's been analyzed and normalized. And straight away you can see we're in a much better place. We've starting to get, something that resembles an audio file now and something that we can hear. So we can hear the intro and the tuning up. And now we can, really hear the instrumentation in the band, and we can start to get an idea of where we're at with the sound of the recording. And once I got to this point, I wasn't too disappointed for a small recorder that I'm guessing that was used. It didn't sound too bad. Obviously, we're some distance away from the band, and I know fine well it was done in a large building, a church. But usable to hear what was going on, and definitely a good reference point for the band, and good to play to people that weren't at the gig, So the next step is really to make things a little bit more uniform. So maybe we can use a second pass of normalization to squeeze a bit more level out of it. To do that, we're really reducing dynamic range. We're really manually doing the job that a compressor does. So I'm going to go ahead and grab some of these larger sections and just go to adjust amplitude. And I'm going to guess that we need about sort of 2-3 dB of reduction. That looks about right. And you can be pretty, you don't have to be mad accurate with something not normalize, just adjust amplitude. You don't have to be super accurate with something as large as this, because you're not really going to notice these sort of changes in volume so much with such a long file. And especially if it's not very, very critical, you don't have to be extremely careful. Then start to look for peaks. I'll just show you what I did there. I noticed that there was a peak here, and I don't want anything to be affecting our next pass of normalization. So zoom in on this peak, grab it, and adjust the amplitude again. Just a couple of dB will do, and it's just the same sort of thing as a compressor would be doing, really. And then we're going to fit the whole thing in again. And this is starting to look better to me. Let's have a look at this peak here. Maybe we could sort of do a little bit of... And what you want to do, I've done this quite a lot of times, but what you want to do is sort of listen back to check, that you're not affecting the audio too much. And you see, this is a lot more uniform now. And now if we run a second pass of normalization, and obviously we've got a progress bar, not quite as long this time, it's going to find the maximum peak, and then it's going to ask us if we'd like to normalize to 0 dB. And I'm going to say, yes, please. It's going to run the normalization. I'll pan away for the second. And now you can see that we've got a much healthier file. We've got a normalized file, and things are starting to sound pretty good. Now, at this point, what I wanted to do was fade in the intro here, just very small fades, just to make it sound slightly more professional, and do the same with the end. And you'll be able to hear that this sounds a lot better. You could have probably less crowd noise on the beginning there than that. As much or little as you want, really, but just, I think, a fade. There we go. That's quite nice. And I quite like having, if it's a long gig, it's nice to build a little bit of atmosphere. And you can hear the musicians tuning up. Great. So we're at a point now where realistically we can sort of run a mastering process on it. Obviously, with something this long, it's not going to be a pure science, but again, we can improve it. So I'm going to save it as an AAF, and we're going to go with 16-bit. It was an MP3, but let's keep it at 16-bit so we can run the mastering process. You could even work at 24-bit. Might be a little overkill for something like this. Again, if it's something very critical and you really want to squeeze the best out of it, you could run it at 16-bit. So I'm going to save this on my desktop as 16-bit now. But before we do that, you've actually got to flatten all the actions. And once that's done and it's saved, I'm going to open it up in Logic and come back and show you what my next stage was. Okay, so here we are in Logic, and you can see that I've imported my my file into Logic, into Simple Audio Track in Logic. Now, what you do here is really down to personal preference, and if you've got your own favorite mastering chain, then you want to use those plugins. And the reason I'm in the DAW here is so that I can load a chain of plugins. In an audio editor, usually you can do that in some audio editors, but usually it's a little bit more convoluted. So this is an ideal way of loading up a number of plugins. First of all, I'll show you the order of plugins that I've used. I've used a bus compressor. So any any bits that aren't really sort of uniform and any big dips and, peaks in dynamic range, hopefully this will start to take care of. So at the loudest sections here, in fact, I'll bypass everything bar the plugin we're talking about. The loudest sections here should be sort of reduced to some extent. So just by a couple of dB, nothing too heavy, like 2 or 3 dB at the top. And then we want to sort of use the makeup gain to dial it in so that we've still got 2 or 3 dB of headroom on the master out. Great. And you can use any bus compressor for that, but any mastering grade compressor, in fact, any compressor realistically, as long as it's, decent quality. Next up, I'm using something that not all of you are going to have. But this is, and it looks very complicated, maybe to the beginner, but ultimately it's MS processing and mid-side processing, and I am using this mainly to reduce the stereo image of the low end. So this thing called the mono maker down here, everything below 300 hertz is made mono. Check out Brainworks' site. They do a mini plugin called BX Control, I think it is, and that will just give you the mono maker. I'm also enhancing the low end and the mono information. Next up, a dedicated mastering EQ. It's a posh one from UAD. It's a Manly passive clone, emulation. And it's really just adding low end and filtering everything below 12 hertz. So we're getting rid of any nasty subsonics. You could go a little higher than that if you want. And then I'm boosting everything below 100 hertz with a shelf EQ here, just to try and claw some of the low end back that was lost with using the handheld recorder. After this, some multi-band compression. Now again, this was to reduce anything in the sort of high mids and anything, try and boost the lows a little bit. You can see this happening here. And it's a bit of a trick in that you can sort of cut with the compressor and then boost with the level. And you get an interesting effect. And then I've got this mixed. Let me just use the output level here. I've got this mixed at about 60%. So we've got some of the dry level coming through. So sort of parallel compression, multi-band compression. And then finally, I've got a limiter. And it's just a classic mastering limiter. And I'm looking for about 3 dB of reduction probably. So we can dial a little bit more in. It's pretty sort of organic music, so we don't want to limit this too hard. You're just looking for a nice full level as opposed for a slammed output, that you'd maybe getting in electronic music. But now we can hear what's going on. We can hear all the instruments. We can hear the crowd. We've got about as much bottom end as we're going to get out of it without really dialing too much in. And the quiet sections still sound good. We can hear them, they're still about 5 times louder than the whole recording was when we first got our hands on it. And then once you've finished your mastering chain, and like I say, you can really use any sort of type of mastering tools you want, as long as they're getting this job done and really trying to boost, what's there and not add too much artificial processing. And then you can export the whole thing. In fact, let's use my bounce. And you can see that I've already done a couple of versions here, but I'm going to export it in 16-bit. And if you've moved from 24, you'll want to dither it. And once you've done that, you can just export it as whatever you want. I'm going to call it MoMaster. I'm going to hit bounce and then come back to you and show you the final stage for getting it off to the band or whoever you want to. Okay, so now we've got our final bounce finished. And this is the one here. We can convert it to MP3, and I just use a simple sound converter, and there's a million programs that do this, but just drag and drop your mastered file, and you can then convert this to any sort of MP3 sort of quality you like. I like to work with 320s because they're about the best, And once we've got it, me just undo that move there. Once you've got it, and I've done one here previously, you can check it out. And we've gone to 90 meg. This is actually smaller than the original MP3 that was recorded. And just stop moving files around, and then we might be able to listen to it. Just flick through it, check it out. And the original sounded like this. Okay, so, a massive change in level, but not just level. We saw when it was normalized. If you open the file here, you can see the difference even between the normalized and the limited. There's the normalized. I mean, that would probably do in itself. This is just a step further to get the maximum amount of volume out of it. And it looks pretty heavily limited, but actually it's just because it's such a large file. When you zoom in, you can see that there's a decent amount of headroom still there. Great, so hopefully that gives you an idea of the workflow involved in rescuing a stereo recording that basically isn't optimal. And to beginners out there and people recording bands, hopefully this might be some help to you.